Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you also to the IAP at Liechtenstein for hosting this conference. I'm very excited by this whole area of special divine action. I say a few years ago I wasn't so much excited as nervous, because it does take a certain courage to go into this area initially. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, because there is a resistance to looking into this area. But if you overcome that resistance, then a world of exciting discovery opens up. So I've been running over the last 3 years a project called the Special Divine Action Project at Oxford. And as was mentioned in the introduction, my background, I've covered several different careers really. So first of all, when I was a teenager, I wanted to be an astronaut. But there were no job opportunities for astronauts at that time. So I decided to study physics because I reasoned as a teenager that physics is the science which is the key to other sciences. So if you don't know what you want to do in the science, then physics is a good place to start. I thought I could specialize later. And when I went to Oxford, I discovered there's another area of exciting discovery of inner space, not outer space. And at that time, Europe was hitting the headlines for taking the lead in particle physics. So all our best scientists had gone to the United States after the Second World War because it was better resources and Californian sunshine. But gradually we were building up a research base in Europe at the CERN laboratory, and I ended up doing a project there for 3 years looking for the Higgs boson, which was called the God particle by a publisher. We didn't find that, but during the time I was there, a colleague of mine invented something else which changed our lives. His name was Tim Berners-Lee, and he invented the internet. So while I was there, the World Wide Web spread around the world. And I remember Bill Gates saying, "The internet will never amount to anything." Just shows how surprised people were when this development happened. I worked for 7 years in scientific and business consultancy here in Latin America, and then I started training to be a priest. And when the supernatural call came, I thought as a businessman. I realized in business we make things that don't last very long. In the computer business, 3 to 5 years. But if you invest in the soul, that seems like a good long-term investment. So I just thought that as a business case, this seems like a good long-term investment. And then when I started training to be a priest, the church helped to civilize me because it made me study philosophy for the first time. And I didn't, you see, as a scientist, studying physics, I was told by one of my professors at Oxford, we understand everything about the world down to one 10 millionth of an atomic diameter. Okay? That's the attitude in physics, at least by some people. And I had to start learning all over again the study of philosophy and theology. I'm very grateful to the church for civilizing me. And then I specialized in philosophy. Ended up doing 8 years, including 4 years with a woman called Eleanor Stump, whom some of you may know, in the United States. And then I returned to Oxford to theology faculty. So I don't really know what I'm doing, but when you ask children what do you want to be when you grow up, just have fun, intellectual fun. And if you can keep changing and developing and growing, this is a good general strategy. So I want to talk about the Special Divine Action Project, and really it's very simple. I'm going to try to entertain you because I think that in the academic world we ought to try to communicate things clearly and with a certain amount of fun. And this, I'm afraid, is a reaction against some of my training. So I mentioned that the church had civilized me by teaching me philosophy, but the way they did it was not always very good. So I remember spending 7 years in Rome, where an Italian professor with a strong Spanish accent would read from a book like this. Blah, 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 blah. Right? And I think this is not necessary, right? It is not a mark of intellectual success to be unclear. And there is a $500 billion industry out there called advertising, which specializes in getting complicated messages across in 30 seconds or less. And they dominate the thinking of our young people. So if we have a message of insight for the world, or many messages of insight for the world, we have to think about salesmanship, about communication. So I want to show you a few outputs from the project. Then I want to introduce you to some of the in-depth scholarly resources we've been creating, and then outline briefly how this work will develop in future. So why study special divine action? Well, just to go to a few basics. Of course, it's quite hard to define special divine action, and there are always presuppositions built into any definition. But a working definition is better than no definition. So here's a working definition of special divine action. Denotes a conception of divine action beyond that of a first or uncaused cause, or cosmic designer or sustainer. And here, of course, the implicit reaction is against deism. And a lot of this whole project, if you like, is a response to the deist stance towards the world. Special divine action is normally thought of in terms of intervention, as presupposing an ordinary, regular order of the world. I'll return to that theme later, but divine intervention presupposes order. The recognition of divine intervention presupposes order. So, in response to one of the common objections, that you can't be a natural scientist and believe in special divine action, well, you've got to have a very robust view of how nature ordinarily works to even be able to recognize special divine action for what it is. I think they're actually symbiotic and not in opposition. Now, in the Anglo-Saxon world since the 18th century, though influenced a lot by other countries, particularly French deism, the questions have been principally about miracles, as you will know, and I'm sorry because we had Hume. I discovered, by the way, in this course of this project, that Hume is in my family tree. So I, as a priest, I'm not sure he'd be very happy with my profession, but I do pray for his soul. And I apologise to Hume because I know he influenced Kant, who's now dominated the German world. I'm so sorry. Okay. Now, within the world of theological discourse, the topic is broader. And this is something else. Now, of course, most of the project was about miracles. The topic of miracles dominates the discussion. But it's important to remember that special divine action is a much bigger and more interesting topic than miracles. Most of the other kinds of special divine action are more interesting. Sanctifying grace should be about the fourth or fifth most important topic in theology. And one of the tragedies I face today in the Catholic world is we've forgotten the term grace. I gave a talk recently to head teachers of schools in the north of England. And I asked them, what is grace? And none of them knew anything. Right? So this is terrifying to me. We are custodians of a beautiful tradition, a rich tradition. We've not passed it on to our children, and we're starting as if from scratch. So there's sanctifying grace, and there's also the issue of inspiration, which overlaps with insight, which overlaps with Gestalt perception, all that sort of thing. Very interesting areas here. And providence, some people think it's another kind of miracle, but actually most people define providence in terms of natural causation, or things that don't exceed the natural powers of nature, the ordinary powers of nature, but just directed towards an end. So clarifying that distinction is important as well. Now, of course, you'll be very familiar with this, but since at least the time of the deist controversies of the 18th century, there's been a tendency to shrink the range of theological questions that are deemed amenable and acceptable to the methods of reason. I have a complaint about what we call the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment philosophers normally begin by telling us what we are not allowed to think. It's even in the titles of the books. With religion within the limits of pure reason, you cannot go beyond these limits. I stipulate from the beginning that you're not allowed to go beyond these limits, right? So the scope has been shrunk and shrunk down in such a way as to curtail consideration of special divine action. And this tendency has been influenced a lot by borrowing a narrative that looks to physics for its defense. So a conception of the world as a closed system of space-time within which there are particles, forces and laws acting in a consistent, purposeless, machine-like way. It's interesting that some of the most important breakthroughs in physics the last 100 years have been based upon going beyond that conception. And Albert Einstein saw that light is more fundamental than space and time, for example. And in quantum mechanics, again, many, many more mysteries. So, but this is the narrative, and it's a representation of the world that stopped being a representation and has taken over in people's minds the picture of the whole of reality. And of course, in this context, debates over STA have typically been limited to the validity and limits of physicalism, focusing especially or exclusively on the issue of miracles.
And so,
Sorry. Okay. There may be a lightning bolt. That's one point. Okay, right. So, when I'm talking about this to teachers, I also explain some other reasons why it is important to go beyond, or I point out some problems with a priori physicalism. One cannot understand religious traditions and their language games on their own terms. There's a cognitive bias in the reading of religious texts. They filter out those aspects most relevant to understanding and impact. I think it has huge impact on our human self-understanding. I'll come to this point later. But if God cannot intervene freely, the same arguments are used against human freedom. That's why I'm very excited by the project you have at Liechtenstein, because you've linked those two things together, free will and divine intervention. These two are symbiotic. If we lose one, we lose the other as well. There's danger we lose the other one as well. A priori physicalism can introduce a bias in our academic fields, reducing the scope of human motivations to material goods. And it's not entailed by physics. It's interesting, a lot of philosophers of physics, a lot of philosophers of science never talk to scientists. They never talk to physicists. And I'm happy, if there are some here, I'm happy to talk to you. But what is physics?
So test.
What is physics? I mean, physics, at least in the experience of doing experiments in physics, it is the study of the quantitative behavior of two-body systems. The quantitative behavior of two-body systems, which are the only systems we can integrate. But there are many, many fields of human knowledge and activity outside the scope of physics. And here's a simple example. Here's a question which looks like a physics problem. Is Pluto a planet? Is Pluto a planet? Now, it looks like a scientific problem. It looks like a physics problem. But when astronomers 15 years ago, addressed this problem, they had to become amateur Aristotelian philosophers, because it cannot be solved by measuring things. You have to make a judgment of reason that Pluto belongs to a different kind of class of object to those of the planets. So there are many questions, many kinds of knowledge which are not within the scope of physics or physical methods. And that's not to denigrate physics, it's just to explain, to understand properly what physics does and what it doesn't do. What physics does very well is understand the quantitative behavior of two-body systems, or things that can be modeled as aggregations or perturbations of two-body systems, and that is it. I mentioned how physicalism affects other fields. I mentioned this book because it made me think a lot about how history is affected by physicalist presuppositions. Michael Burley's book Sacred Causes was an unusual book published in England a few years ago. And what it took seriously is belief in divine action in human affairs. And that can be a good beliefs and bad beliefs. But treating these as important, as causal, as facts of history, and how they motivate people. And it made me look at the history of the 20th century very differently. I think a lot of our politicians are very bad at handling issues, particularly in the Middle East or with terrorism, because they do not understand because they have Marxist presuppositions in their thinking which reduce all human motivations to material causation or desire for goods. And so they handle these situations very badly because they don't understand non-materialist motivations. I think physicalism has also partly destroyed the study of Scripture. A beautiful example is the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus in the Old Testament. You can read it spiritually. And spiritually, it is a story of a soul. So you start with Egypt, which is the state of original sin, crossing the Red Sea, which is baptism, 40 years in the wilderness. That's this life, I'm sorry. The wilderness can be quite nice sometimes. But fed from manna from heaven every day, the Eucharist, crossing the river Jordan, the river of death, into the promised land, the kingdom of heaven, and followed and accompanied by the Ark of the Covenant, a symbol of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so you've got in Exodus a spiritual reading of Exodus, like a second order reading. But if you just read Scripture with historical critical methods, all this becomes invisible. You don't see it anymore. And you don't understand even how people read Scripture. If your training is exclusively in naturalistic methods. So the topic is interesting. It ought to be of interest to all those who think SDA is possible or happens, also to those who are indifferent but who still want to understand what belief means in special divine action and its impact on the world. But in theology and religious studies, almost all the interesting questions involve special divine action. So without consideration of special divine action, theology is dead. The theology is essentially dead. It becomes sociology or history or the study of ancient languages. But even from the self-interest of theologians who want to stay in employment, they ought to look at special divine action. And for us as human beings, what hopes have we for our ultimate purpose and destiny without SDA? I'll come back to that at the moment. So, very grateful for the John Templeton Foundation who funded this project to stimulate new scholarly and public engagement with special divine action. On the website, we set ourselves a little exercise, what's in it for me? This is something used in business, in marketing. In marketing, people have to keep considering, what's in it for me? Why should I study this? Why should I invest time in this? And these are just a quick few bylines. We've written a few more paragraphs, but these are quick bylines. So for philosophers, you gain a new world of ideas to explore. And frankly, philosophy quickly becomes dull without consideration of special divine action. In 2009, the Oxford Philosophy faculty had a conference on the incarnation and the mind-body problem. And I was shocked. I thought I'd fallen into a parallel universe, because in Oxford, for the last 40, 50 years, they don't really consider, well, not much, they're not giving great consideration to God at all, right? And now they had a conference on the incarnation. And my only conclusion was they had got bored. So, because if you've reduced things down to positivism, then eventually you've got nothing left to talk about. So philosophers almost say, well, come back in, let's just discuss this is fun. For theologians, you can't live without it. There'll be no theology without special divine action or belief in special divine action. Even for science, there are issues here. Scientific understanding, motivation, ethics are all affected, at least a little bit, by considerations of special divine action. How we look at the world, the heuristics with how we look at the world. I can discuss that in more detail if you want. Historians, you can benefit from seeing the ways in history has been read as his story. Come back, yes. There's a film I saw recently about the near disaster at Dunkirk, another war film. It's a very strange film because it was put together as the first 3/4 of the film are a set of disconnected disasters. And then in the last quarter of the film, suddenly a narrative is formed by the filmmaker out of all the disasters. And I think this is how providence works. We can only see it in retrospect. So it was a very interesting example of a recent film which showed history almost being formed in retrospect from a narrative being formed in retrospect from a series of apparently disconnected events. Psychology. You're interested in the human mind and how cultures, interested in human mind and the cultures arising from the ways in which the mind grasps truth. Literary scholars, one problem we have at Oxford now is our students in English do not know the English language very well, because there are words and allusions and phrases which come from scripture, which itself is inspired by special divine action. And so they can't interpret English texts, they sometimes don't know English phrases. The writing on the wall is a phrase from Daniel in the Old Testament, but it's missed by a lot of students today. Scripture scholars, you need to know what the writers and believing readers of scripture see. Atheists, you want to know how others think and to develop your own ideas for humane flourishing. Ministers, you want your ministry to be fruitful. And artists, what do you think art is for in the absence of special divine action? It's a big crisis today in art. What is art for? And what hope is there without SDA? On the subject of art, some of you may have seen this before, but I want to show you quickly what happens when you lose special divine action as a theme in art. So this is a history of art in 3 minutes from 1432. So here you have the concretely given supernatural. This was the big theme of Western art for nearly 1,000 years. And this is one of its supreme images, a symbolic picture of the kingdom of heaven, painted in 1432, the Van Eyck Mystic Lamb, one of my favourite paintings. Now in 1524 we start getting rid of the saints. We're focusing more on nature. The saints are becoming smaller. In 1569, the church has retreated to behind that tree in this picture, and now the focus is purely on nature. We see naturalism arising in the imagination. In 1821, Constable's The Hay Wain. It's the high point of English romantic painting, but there's no concretely given supernatural anymore. A god is at best the deist god, or maybe the creator god in the background. So what happens next? 1890, Vincent van Gogh, wheat field with crows. The road isn't going anywhere, and the vertical dimension is beginning to collapse. And then 1947, Jackson Pollock's Enchanted Forest. Now, I've long learned I don't make aesthetic judgments anymore, because some people get very defensive about Jackson Pollock. So you can make your own judgments. But all I want to just emphasize to you is that as we lose the theme of special divine action in art, look what's happening to our perception of the natural world. And what's happening to some of our cities. This is seriously, London in 2011, we had some riots on the streets. No real reason, it was just nihilistic riots, you know. Because what is society for? What is the purpose of life? What will hold it all together? It doesn't have to go that way. I saw visiting the Sagrada Familia Cathedral, so Basilica in Barcelona recently. You can have modern and you can have beautiful, but this is focused on special divine action. Okay, project outputs and so on. So the project ran for 3 years. We had a first sort of research meeting in 2012. Richard Swinburne was one of the contributors to that. And then when we were awarded the project in 2014, there were 3 teams involved. So it's ourselves at Oxford, the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion, the Faculty of Philosophy at Western Michigan University. That was led by Timothy McGrew. And Timothy McGrew has been working on the whole topic of divine action for 10 years and assembling a lot of historical sources which are just not read today. So the issue that his concern is people only read David Hume. And there are thousands of good authors that are unread, largely unread, from that period, that 200-year period, before and after David Hume. And he said, and he's a very good philosopher and chair of his faculty, but he said it's the best thing he's ever done in his academic career, to study these sources properly. And so from his point of view, what he wanted to do with the project was make the sources more widely available. And we had the help of the Texas Center for Applied Technology to help us develop some digital tools, which are now hosted at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. We want to encourage renewed interest and research in the questions surrounding special divine action, for all those reasons I mentioned earlier. But as a metaphor, we wanted to break a spell. Is that clear in German? I don't know. Break a spell, right? The spell is the following. The topic of STA is unworthy of consideration. You cannot study this. because the case is closed. Hume said so. Or the topic is uninteresting, or there's nothing to be said with the tools we normally use. There are other reasons we could give for this. And this spell is closely linked with a more powerful spell. It's called the Cartesian worldview. I don't know if you're familiar with a story called The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. Do you know the story of the Snow Queen? I recommend it. It's wonderful. And it's haunted me for 40 years. I heard this story when I was 8 years old, and it gave me a kind of shiver. About a boy who has splinters in his eye. He can't see the world properly. He only sees mathematical forms. He loves snowflakes, not real flowers. He stops being interested in his playmates and his grandmother. And he's caught by the Snow Queen and put in her palace. And in her palace, he has to arrange ice blocks, trying to spell the word eternity. And 40 years later, I realized this is also a story of Descartes. And I think even Hans Christian Andersen may have been drawing a very direct parallel, because Descartes died of the cold teaching philosophy to Queen Christina of Sweden. But we have this cold mathematical world. And I love physics, by the way. But if we think of these representations from the mechanical behavior of two-body systems as telling us how the whole world works, that can become a trap for the mind. And if nothing is held to exist outside that trap, then we are in a spell. We are in enchantment. Our children would understand that very well if they still read Hans Christian Andersen. So we need to break this spell and have some fun. So I want to just now introduce a couple of videos. This is a short introduction to the project. I hope it's not completely boring to you, but someone who may have seen it before. But I think it sums up the project very well in 3 minutes.
Is every thought, is every action in the cosmos only an effect of some other thought or some other action in the cosmos? Or is there something more? Is there divine intervention? Is there divine inspiration? One fact is certain. Belief in these special divine actions has had an immense impact on human society and civilization. Such beliefs shape, often decisively, the way we think about the world, what we do in the world, and what we hope for now and in the future. Human beings have given many names to the various purported effects of special divine action, including grace, inspiration, miracles, and providence. The interpretations of such effects, their possible causes and reasons, are among the most important challenges we face as individual persons and in our societies today. Is special divine action possible? And if so, how would we know? What views are held about the kinds, causes, and implications of such actions? How does purported special divine action fit with our observations and with our philosophical, religious, and scientific worldviews? Are there advantages or disadvantages to holding particular beliefs about these matters? Does science explain or explain away special divine action? Can new research provide insights and metaphors for such action? The exploration of these topics also encourages us to reflect on other major questions in science, philosophy, and theology, such as the meaning of causation, of action and potential, of information and cognition, and of what it means to be a person. Such issues have been examined many times since the development of modern science, but much of what has been written in recent centuries is surprisingly little read today. With the help of new digital humanities technology, the Special Divine Action Project at Oxford University aims to recover the wisdom of the past on these questions and to bring this wisdom into dialogue with contemporary work in science, philosophy, religious studies, and theology. Conferences, courses, competitions, debates, and presentations will stimulate new research. Summaries, videos, and digital tools will provide resources for academics, teachers, students, and the broader public. By enabling access to past wisdom and contemporary research into the issues of special divine action, this project will promote new intellectual engagement with one of the greatest spiritual and intellectual quests of humanity.
That video was designed to whet people's interest and get them engaging in the materials. By the 31st of December 2016, we had 48 known publications published, delivered, or under contract. Particular highlights, there's a special edition of the European Journal of Philosophy of Religion with a collection of papers from our first conference. There's a very fine paper with Professor von Wachter. Graham Twelftree, one of the advisors, collected some essays together on nature miracles of Jesus, coming out later this year. A very good summary article of the thinking behind the project you can find at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the article on miracles, which was written by Timothy McGrew, who was our colleague on the project. Had 120 conference presentations, 112 public talks, 123 videos, 1,800 historical works in the database, and various media outreach. So I want to just give you a little bit of a taste of these resources. And we worked quite hard on 3 minute and 1 minute cartoons. The terrifying thing is people's attention span. So with our young people, 3 minutes is a bit long. So what could you teach in 1 minute? And of course, the shorter it is, the harder it is to compress it. So we had a go, and the main ideas we wanted to communicate under grace, inspiration, miracles, and providence. With grace, this is my own big area of research, but I wanted to look at organic metaphors and the I-thou relationship, which I think is the characteristic of grace in the Christian understanding. It enables a second-person relationship to God. With inspiration, we wanted to just hint at the links to work with people like Wittgenstein, seeing how things fit together. And also the issue of social insight, how teachers accelerate insights. This is how almost the definition of teaching. A good teacher accelerates insights. And perhaps a relationship with God, a personal God, also accelerates insights. Miracles, the limits of natural causation and Pascal's extended wager. And with providence, the heuristics for narrative viewing of time and history. So here are a few tasters. Here was the grace video.
What is grace?
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it too loud? I apologize. I will just do that.
What is grace?
It's I don't have direct control except here. Let me just see if I can. Thank you for saying that.
What is grace? In everyday language, grace means a freely bestowed gift, worthy of admiration and associated with the idea of blessing, beauty, and salvation. As a special divine action, grace is also identified with an unmerited gift or favor from God. In Christian theology, the various names and types of grace share one key idea: a second birth into a new and holy life, like a seed in the ground that grows into a plant and bears fruit. In this new life of grace, a human being participates in the life of God, becoming an adopted child of God, addressing God personally and calling God Father. St. Augustine, as a young man in the Roman Empire, speculated about the existence and nature of divinity. Only after his conversion into the life of grace, however, did he speak to God in personal, passionate, and intimate terms. Late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you. How does contemporary research help us to understand the idea of grace? A metaphor from psychology is that grace removes an innate spiritual blindness or autism towards God. On this account, the acceptance of grace is like drawing back a veil, enabling a person to know God and to live in the hope of seeing God face to face. Also on this account, grace imprints the development of a person's moral, intellectual, and spiritual dispositions. Other people are seen as children of God in grace, and life takes on a sacramental and liturgical character. Given the far-reaching consequences for works of mercy, art, law, music, science, and much else besides, the study of grace is clearly important for its own sake, but also helps us to understand our civilization.
By the way, I apologise for the high sound. I can't seem to control it from here, so if there is anyone with technical expertise, I will try to turn it down. But the controls don't seem to work, so I'm afraid I must have just put up with it. So that was the Grace introduction. I wanted now to show you one of our 1-minute cartoons. And we invented a character called Albert. It looked a bit like a Dominican. And we put him...
Albert explores inspiration. Divine inspiration is a special insight given by God. But what is insight? Insight is like seeing how things fit together, the big picture. And this fitting together is easier if a second person helps us to understand. Divine inspiration works in a similar way. God rarely reveals new facts that we could not learn for ourselves. Instead, divine inspiration helps us to see what we know from new perspectives. Just as a good teacher can lead us to new insights, the cultivation of a personal relationship to God may inspire us in many extraordinary and creative ways.
It took 15 months to write these. Okay. So, now I want to look briefly at miracles. This time I'm going to show you one of the 3-minute videos. And you'll see basically a kind of extended Pascal's wager here.
Objects of wonder are all around us in the natural world. Many of these works of beauty provoke amazement, even when we know what caused them. But are there other objects of wonder, true miracles without natural causes, which may be attributed to special divine action? In early modern science, when the universe was thought of like a machine, a miracle was defined in terms of breaking the laws of nature. The natural world today appears more complex, embracing spontaneity, information, indeterminism, and personal action. In light of these changes, a miracle may be better thought of as an extraordinary event that exceeds the productive power of nature. Are such miracles possible? If so, do miracles happen? Even accounts of Revelation treat such signs and wonders as rare. Indeed, miracles are rare almost by definition, since the extraordinary presupposes the ordinary, just as a river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. Given the success of science in uncovering the regularities of nature, why should we even consider the possibility of miracles? One reason is that these investigations have proved fruitful in the history of ideas. Careful theoretical and practical considerations of the questions about miracles have stimulated the development of philosophy and interest in experimental methods to isolate and identify causes. Questions about miracles are also connected to questions about our own freedom. If a human person is free to interrupt the law-like behavior of a falling stone, then why not a divine agent? If, on the other hand, divine intervention is declared impossible, how does human free will escape the same judgment in a world of impersonal causes, reducing human beings to machines? But there is another reason for examining questions about miracles. Despite its many wonders, the natural world appears to lack resources to make us perfectly and permanently happy, especially given personal death and eventual cosmic death. A starting point that treats miracles as rare if they happen, but worthy of consideration as possible gifts and signs of hope, may be more prudent than closing the door on the issue altogether.
Notice there I use the example of throwing an apple in the air and catching it. This is often how I teach this whole issue in the schools, because if I catch a falling stone or catch a falling apple, what's happened there? Am I just obeying the laws of physics when my hand reaches out and catches the apple? Or am I freely choosing to catch the apple? And if I'm freely choosing to catch the apple, then why can't God? Why can't God work a miracle? So this is where the issue of miracles is so closely intertwines with the issue of our own freedom, and the loss of one, or the forbidding of one, almost leads directly to the forbidding of other kinds of personal first causation. So one more cartoon to show you. This is the Providence. I'm going to show you the Albert version.
Albert explores Providence. Providence is God providing and ordering things to some good goal or destination. Providence is divine action, but unlike miracles, the working of providence is hidden in natural causes, often leading us to some unexpected destination. The care of providence, however, shares with human freedom the shaping of the paths of our lives. This care implies God reshaping the possibilities ahead of us as we make our choices. But because only natural causes are experienced at each step, it is only when looking back on the journey that the work of providence may be seen.
You can read the sophisticated account of one of Newman's sermons, but that's the very basic account. Okay. So, as well as the cartoons and videos, we had interviews on the big questions, and all these illustrious interviewees. And I want to just give you one or two of these. This is by the co-project leader, Timothy McGrew.
Sometimes get asked by students, what should I do, high school age students or assist?
Lost it. I'm not having much success with this. So I'll just redo that. Well, I can't show you any of these lovely videos. Okay, so recommend going online to the Special Divine Action website or to the YouTube channel and taking a quick look. But one of the ones I wanted to show you was also by Raymond Tallis, because he's an atheist. And his interview was very interesting, because he said, well, he explained that atheists are also interested in these questions. They've got similar kinds of problems to solve about life and its purpose. So he was very excited in the project, and was a great supporter. We also developed two online courses. One was called the Deist Controversy, and these are now loaded on the Oxford University podcast system. So you can actually get a complete set of lectures there. There are 18 on the Deist Controversy leading up to Hume. And there was a second course called the Great Debate of 15 lectures, and that takes up the end of the Victorian age. And those for graduate level students, it was, I think the material covers more material than most academics have in terms of the knowledge of this period. So I think it's an excellent resource. We're going to try again. The speakers are off too. The speakers are off too, oh dear.
Argued ideas from theologians is a very good way of, if you like, almost reactively defining what one's own beliefs are.
We'll just try that one again.
So I am a humanist, and you might be puzzled as to why a humanist would be interested in engaging in such a recherche topic for a humanist as special divine action. I think my feeling is the humanist project has only just begun. And my feeling is that as humanists, we should try to define ourselves not necessarily in relation to supernatural explanations, but more importantly, not to naturalizing explanations either, that sees us purely as a part of nature. I don't think we're a part of nature, or if we are, we're also apart from it. And trying to define ourselves between those two extremes is the central challenge of humanism. And bouncing oneself off against ideas, particularly well thought out, carefully argued ideas from theologians, is a very good way of, if you like, almost reactively defining what one's own beliefs are.
I just wanted to give you just two more quick clips, because it helps to understand the project. And this was by Timothy McGrew, and one of the questions I asked was, do you have advice for young scholars, particularly in regard to the study of special divine action?
I sometimes get asked by students, what should I do? High school age students or sixth formers saying, well, where should I go from here? Should I study philosophy, theology? And I never tell them, well, there's only one field to study, because it's just not true. I wanted to be an astrophysicist or a poet, and I wound up as a philosopher. What kind of a crazy medium is that? But I do think it's very important for young people going into almost any discipline to realize that short, skeptical questions are easy, and long, thoughtful answers require erudition and patience. And they need to settle it in their own minds right away, that they're not going to start walking away once they've heard the snappy question. Right? When Pilate says to Jesus, what is truth? The tragic part is he walks away before he can hear an answer. Don't do that. There are questions that seem quite devastating or quite conclusive until you thoughtfully probe. And for the sake of doing that, I would say don't ignore, don't neglect the older literature. Sometimes people investigated these with great thoughtfulness and with great learning, and sometimes they gave better answers than the ones that are circulating even among well-educated people today. So it's very important to remember the past. Don't just read modern biblical criticism, though don't neglect it by any means. But also go back and read Augustine. Go back and read Jerome. Read Irenaeus. Don't settle for a one-dimensional view of the subject. History offers us depth, and that would be the first piece of advice that I would give to such a young person.
There are many other wonderful short interview clips. I can't go into them now. I just point out in passing that many of our speakers have had quite a wide range of styles. So many people gave 1 or 2 minute answers. The exception was Professor Richard Swinburne, whose answers came out as 12-minute complete chunks, beautifully ordered. So although he has only a few talks on the site, they are in depth and beautifully set out. Okay. Okay, finally I want to look at the thematic and historical database. And this is an impossible task. How do you write a general introduction to special divine action? It's like trying to write a dictionary or an encyclopedia. It's actually impossible. But eventually we drew up this map, and we more or less got articles for all of these different topics. Some of them are still to be loaded in a database or still to be checked. But roughly speaking, this is how we divided up the field. So we have special divine action. We've got the meaning, got grace, inspiration, miracles, and providence, various narratives like watchmaker or gardener, various kinds of encounters. Is it different from the first person, the second person, and the third person perspective? So the issue of testimony comes into there. There are different worldviews. What kind of religions? We've got very nice articles, by the way, on Hinduism and Buddhism. What about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Greek and Roman world? And then there are philosophies of God, classical theism, omni-God, concurrentism, occasionalism, panentheism, process theology, open theism, impersonal conceptions of God, agnosticism and atheism. And then philosophies of the world, with laws of nature, physics issues, panpsychism, emergentism, hylomorphism, indeterminism, determinism, dualism, materialism. You see very many different views of this. And then there's the histories, historical development, philosophy of history and history of philosophy. Two different takes on that. Key problems. And of course key figures here as well. So this is roughly speaking the thematic map of the topic as we developed it, and many of those are now loaded on the Special Divine Action website. But as time is running short, what I want to do now is finish off with the historical database, which was our pièce de résistance of the project, and quite experimental really, because what we wanted to do was to use a metaphor to reveal a landscape of ideas. What's happened in the study of this topic is that we've got a submerged landscape, and there are just one or two key rocks emerging from the landscape. One's labelled David Hume. And what we wanted to do was to drain the water and show the interconnection of people and ideas, and get people reading more, and get people exploring figures they may not have heard about, so that the topic is explored with more depth and more breadth. Hopefully we can get this working. Let's see if this works. Right, I've got to do something funny with this. Let's see if this works. Yeah. That's it. It's always very scary giving presentations involving technology under these conditions. Okay, so this is our growing interactive database of key figures, and each one of these represents a particular author. So I pointed at David Hume here, and you can hopefully call up information. So a summary on the right-hand side, and then there are particular works we have in the database, and then you can call up the first edition. Hopefully this will work. And there we go. So philosophical works of David Hume, and you can pretty much read the source text of all of these things. So people are familiar with Hume, but let's try the one that's not so familiar. Now you see that arrows connecting the points. Now arrows, the red arrows mean provocations. So things that stimulated a response denying the original thesis, and the blue arrows indicate influences or more other kinds of influences. And then we also have double-ended arrows to indicate possible pattern matches between works. So the idea, gradually people can explore the landscape of the ideas. Now, let's get this working. So I can get Campbell. That's an example. So there's Campbell. So here's someone being provoked by Hume. And we learn a little bit about Campbell there. Then you can read his dissertation Miracles, 1762, and pull it up. And so here you've got the response to Hume, and it's something very wonderful about getting the original text here, and getting history sort of unfiltered, as it were. And we can also show other kinds of connections. We can do traces, so we can take all the influence connections, starting from David Hume, and then explore 2 or 3 levels of influences from his work and explore these other figures. And you can look at inbound connections and outbound connections and so on. So what we're hoping is that people can have intellectual fun exploring this landscape, and will be getting at the deeper level. At the authors have been de facto eclipsed by the concentration in our schools and our colleges on just a few key works. Well, I could go on a lot longer, but I think maybe I ought to. I mean, would you like me to play with the database a bit longer, or shall I call it a day? Maybe call it a day now. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Oh, just before I finish, just point out follow-on work. One of our colleagues at Oxford, Dr. Benedict Gurker, just won a $1.7 million euro grant from the German Research Foundation for his proposal of scientific theology, based at Bochum, and that started 1st July. And Dr. San Giacomo, who contributed to the 2014 conference, got a grant from the Dutch Scientific Research Foundation. So we're very pleased that from this project, other projects have started, and of course, in many ways, what's being done here and the IAP at Liechtenstein is going to continue and extend this work. We see in many exciting ways. So I'm very delighted to be here today, and I wish this work well. Thank you.